Today we're going to talk about a bit more of a technical topic, pro coding with the SDK. We'll get into what that is, but in essence, in the Washington release, ServiceNow's tried to make some improvements and extensions to how we can develop and code within the ServiceNow platform. And we'll talk today through the SDK and how that will work out. Now, as we go, I'd rather just make this a little more interactive. If you have questions or anything, please reach out, just speak up, and we can kind of take this where we take this. So don't be afraid. It'll be helpful. If you have a question, I think a lot of people here will have a question. This is all quite new to all of us. Cool. So what's our agenda? These 7 topics, and I'll be demoing certain things as we go through it. But first, just an introduction to what the SDK is. What is the software development kit? Like, what are we talking about? How do I set up my local environment to leverage it? We're extending out of just developing within the ServiceNow platform where you're starting to do some work in an IDE. So what does that setup look like? How does that work? As an extension of that, what is the development workflow, right? Normally we make an update to a business rule, close our update set, push it up environments. What does that look like with the SDK? And then some more details as we see, like, what are the folders, like what are the different objects we're talking about? The big value here is being able to leverage NPM. So what is that? How do we use it? And then, what is happening when we actually deploy this to an instance? And finally, and maybe even more, most importantly, like, why does this matter, right? What is ServiceNow trying to do? How can it benefit you guys as developers as we go on? So again, this is definitely directed more towards the technical audience, but if you're non-technical and just interested, definitely we'll get some nuggets of wisdom from this, hopefully. So to begin with, what is the SDK? So it came out in the Washington release, and it's a way to create and modify scoped applications where you can leverage custom modules, custom third parties, and such in your code. So think like within, if you're familiar at all with NPM and the 2 million libraries that exist there, the ability to bring those in and leverage those libraries in your code. So to ServiceNow, it's, writing these applications outside of an instance, but enabling you to do a bit more of industry standard development practices with your familiar tools like Visual Studio Code or whichever IDE you like, as well as being able to catch your errors at build time rather than runtime. You can even get a little fancy and add in some unit tests to your code through this. We'll show that later on too. And if any of you are familiar with the Now CLI, which came out a couple versions ago, which is the development interface to create custom components, which you can use in UI Builder, those custom components where you're leveraging React and such. This is similar in the sense that you're developing outside of the instance, but rather than just being focused on those custom components in React and such, this is allowing you to work with more core objects like scripts, business rules, and such, which, I think makes it a bit more usable in practice, per se. Trying to add a slide here, what does this actually mean, right? Like a lot of words. If I'm writing a custom app and want to leverage functions from a common library, such as like Lodash or Validator, again, there's 2 million of them. I know a very small subset of them. So, if you have development experience outside of this, you might come up with a million more use cases than I can. But, cleanse an array of falsy values, validate a string. These are things you can do in ServiceNow for sure. Write a little code and do this. But if you want to use a library which already has a built-in method for this, you can follow this. Again, over 2 million registered libraries, and it's only going to grow. It's a very common way to develop within JavaScript and Node. And also, if you want to include some test-driven development on any of the functions you develop, you can use Node has a lot of built-in functions for that. One I'll show today is the assert and test modules. So this is where we'll start getting into it. How do I set up my local environment to leverage the SDK? So, I'll walk us through this, but I do want to start with saying the documentation is quite good and it walks you through this step by step. When I first did this, I just went through the steps. There were a couple of YouTube videos from ServiceNow walking through this and, coding happy hours and such. So, there's definitely a lot of resources out there to kind of walk you through this step for step, but we'll take a pass at it here ourselves. I'm going to start with the SDK. I'm just going to show you the documentation I was talking about. So installing the SDK. So right? We're working outside of ServiceNow. So we're going to be using the command line interface a little bit to do some things, install some stuff. So ServiceNow is telling you you have to have Node.js installed at version 16.6 or later, npm at version 8. They'll even tell you how you can check these things. So if I'm looking at a command line right here and I want to see if I have Node installed, I can go node -v. It'll tell me I have version 20.11.1, which is great. Know that this will work. Can also do node package manager v, and that's great too. The other one, and this is node version manager. You can have multiple node versions on your machine at any time. If you want to see all the node versions you have, you can use nvmls. And we can see we have multiple here. I bring this up for an important reason. So when you're installing Node, you can, install like the latest and greatest version, or there's a version that's LTS, which means long-term support, so more of their stable version. When I first did this, I installed their latest version and ran into a ton of errors. So I moved, that was 21.3. So I moved back to their LTS 20.11.1 and worked great. So highly recommend just sticking with their LTS. You'll most likely run into a lot less errors. So if you don't have Node installed, what do you do? I mean, you can just go to Node's website, like install Node, install, anything, and download Node.js. You can download this, and it'll walk you through the process. So again, just a couple of prerequisites that you'll have to follow to go through this. So again, this is all predicated on NPM, which is Node Package Manager. It's how you handle packages across your development projects. And ServiceNow created a package called their ServiceNow SDK, which is where we can do all of the work to authenticate to our instance, to push stuff to our instance, etc. So, once you have Node installed, once you have NPM installed, you need to go and run this function, which is npm install global ServiceNow SDK to install the ServiceNow SDK. The global just means we're going to install it globally to our machine. So it's not specific to the project we're working in, but we're not going to have to install this every time for every project. We can just install it once for everyone. So I have it installed already. I'm not going to go ahead and uninstall it. But what you can do is check if it's installed. You can run a ton of commands. ServiceNow has these documented in terms of how to interact with the Now SDK. So if I run Now SDK help, I will make this a little bigger. They have this fun little SE drawing here, but that will give you some commands you can run. You can see what version you're in. So if I run Now SDK version, I can see I'm in version 1.0.3. You can see I can authenticate to an instance. I can create a custom application in ServiceNow. I can convert an existing scoped application to this SDK. All that means is I'm pretty much making the existing scoped application available to my SDK at that point. We're not like changing anything within the application itself. You can run this fetch command, which we'll see, which is to say, if you updated a business rule in your instance directly, let's run this to make sure we get that metadata back into our project. Build and then deploy. So build will build your whole code. It will kind of compile your code, and then deploy will actually deploy to an instance. So, this is great that they have this here, but better yet, ServiceNow has all of this documented very cleanly in their documentation. So this is a list of all of their commands, how you can, interact with it. So really helpful and easy to walk through, and we're going to start walking through this here. Now, I'm not going to go to the presentation. We'll show the presentation here in a second, but the next step is really, let's go ahead and actually start working with this and build an application. So what I'll do is first, we have the Now SDK installed, right? We have npm, we have Node installed, we have everything installed. I'm in Visual Studio Code here, and I have this folder called SDK Sandbox. So, starting from the beginning, I can just open up my folder here. And each of these parent kind of root directories in this folder are my different projects. So you can see I've played around with 4 or 5 different applications so far. And I'm going to go ahead and create a 6th one right now. So I'm going to just follow the documentation. So, I'll show you what I'm going to do first. So the first thing you have to do is do an authentication here, which is pretty much set up what instance you're interacting with and what user credentials are you using to actually do this work, right? So if I look, I'm going to just do this right here. I'm going to show you the auth that I already have set up. So it's now SDK auth list. And we can see a good old little error there because I most likely don't need to do that. I can just do this. And we can see I'm authenticated to my PDI. I'm just using my admin credentials and it's my default authentication. So whenever I'm setting anything up, it's going to use this. But you can have multiple credentials, right? You could be working against like 8 different instances and then just choose which authentication you're using for each. So we're authenticated at this point. If I needed to create an authentication, I would just follow through this function right here. Just pass in my URL, pass in my username, and then it'll ask me to pass in a password too.
So when you're switching authentication, well, I guess which environment you're authenticating to, do you just have to, like, let's say I'm switching back and forth between clients using this. Do I just have to make sure that I am on the right client before I deploy anything, or is there some kind of something that's going to stop me from accidentally deploying code when I did not intend to?
Yeah, I mean, because your project's gonna not like your scoped app's not going to exist in that other instance with the
Okay,
namespace
so
and
it's a,
everything.
I see.
It'll
So it's not like an environment variable that has your authentication. It's the whole project is per well, that whole project will have an authentication against it.
Yeah, like when you're running your the only things you're going to ever authenticate to are your fetch command and your deploy command. So when you're fetching, taking in what happened, and when you're deploying out, and both of those, you're going to be within your project, and we'll see that your project's going to have a scope tied to it. So if that scope doesn't exist in that instance, it's going to error out immediately and just say, "What are
Got
you
it.
doing?"
Okay, that makes sense.
So, but no, good point, and really only working on one instance here, so not really a consideration for me, and honestly, in practice, if you're working with 8 instances, I just think you'll be switching around a bit, and you can your auth command you can switch your default pretty quickly with one line. So if you know you're going to work with an instance for a while, you can just switch your auth and make it all work pretty easily.
Can this be worked on simultaneously in like both ways? So if I'm working in SDK Sandbox and my other developers are like, no, I have no interest in doing command line, is there any
Yeah.
reason that couldn't be done? Anything one
No,
can
I
do and the other
mean,
can't?
so you'll see like what you really need to do is just run a fetch every time right before you deploy, just to make sure you get everything that's been updated by your developers who are working in their instance normally, and then you deploy it and your stuff will deploy.
Yeah,
So
that's actually a really good point because I've already run into a similar situation with another TC using a similar tool to this, which I don't think is the official ServiceNow one. And they're running into that exact issue because if they don't fetch and they just deploy, it just overwrites any changes that you made.
yeah, and there's a few modes in your deployment. So like incremental, reinstall, complete. So you do have to be somewhat careful,
Uh,
right? You like if you don't fetch it and you do like a full install, you might override what they did, right? In their instance. So definitely a consideration. But normally how ServiceNow has kind of described it is you just run a fetch and then you put your incremental updates and you're only pushing what you've worked on, but you've grabbed everything from the instance right before you do that.
there's a diffing between the two. If we were both working on the same file and I did a fetch, what I had already written my code in my locally and I fetched, does it diff it for you or does it just like how does that function?
Yeah, so
Sorry
I
about the
think it'll help to know
sun.
like so you're not going to be touching a lot of like the pure application files with this, right? You're not going to be like working within a business rule per se in this current version. You're going to be creating your scripts and modules, which then you'll leverage in your business rules. ServiceNow will say you're not going to be touching that metadata or you shouldn't be from this
Okay.
anyway right now. So there wouldn't be really an opportunity for a like a diff in that case,
Okay.
unless you had two people working on the same stuff in the SDK. And at that point, I don't really know right now, to be honest.
It looks like because this uses Git, right? So I'd imagine you would just merge locally
Yeah.
and then pull into.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot to it, and you know, and we'll get into like in practice, like is this really useful? And right now, like this is version 1, right? It's showing that ServiceNow is trying to push towards this as an option for your development. I know in Xanadu, a lot of CreatorCon this past knowledge we're showing like you could show your business rules and work on them and your flows within this, right? Like there's a lot of updates coming in terms of really like putting the work where you're working, right? Like ServiceNow has a big push to that, right? Like as a developer, we're working in the instance all the time. If we want to work in an IDE, that's great, but it's kind of hard when you have to work in both the IDE and the instance, right? Which this is in its current state. So they're trying to make a push to make things that we can do all of the work here, or we can do all the work in the instance, et cetera, et cetera. So the first thing I'm going to do is create an application. And there are a good amount of things you need to set up when you're creating an application. So I just don't have this memorized in any way. So we'll do this. So it's now SDK create, and it's the project name. So we'll do share the wealth 05/117/24, and then scope name. So you have to put in your scope name. So you need to know your scope name. So I have mine written down here. And I'll just do the same thing. Share the wealth. You know what? 24. We'll just do that because I know there's a, if it's over 18 characters, it'll yell at you, and I don't want to have to deal with that today. So that's good. And then you can run an interactive flag and it'll walk you through some of the setup to make it a little easier. So I'll do that. And it's bootstrapping the new application, share the wealth app. We're going to register it on the instance. I don't know why you need to say that, because why wouldn't you? You can see that it's attempting me to log in and it worked. So the auth worked. I'm going to add a sample table so we can see what that looks like. And it's going ahead and creating everything. And if we go here, we can see our folder has been bootstrapped. A lot of stuff is happening and deploying. I think we're good to go soon here. Yep, successfully deployed. So, we'll walk through this folder structure here in a second, but let's just check in our instance what's happening first. So if I go back to my instance, I'm going to just go to Studio for this. Yeah, we can see this app's already here. And they already put a couple of things in here. So, at this point, we auth to an instance, we created a scoped app to the instance. I mentioned earlier, you can convert an existing scoped app to an instance. So I did that with an app I had in my PDI and no real issues with it. Worked pretty easily. Now I'm going to go back to the presentation, just make sure we're caught up. So yeah, so we built to the instance, or we haven't built it deploy. We only created, but once we make a change, we're going to go through the build and deploy process. So now we'll see this in VS Code here in a second, but what I think most of us are not familiar with is kind of how VS Code in like a project directory looks. ServiceNow has this documented again, so I pretty much took this table from them. So again, the docs are quite good for this, so definitely walk through those. But your metadata, this is where all of your XML files live. So if you've ever pushed to GitHub and stuff and seen in GitHub all of your XML files and such, that's pretty much your metadata in the structure. .now is just metadata for the SDK from ServiceNow. You're not going to be touching that. Same with dist. Really, you're not going to be touching that. But these, again, are artifacts ServiceNow has to do the backend work to sync everything. Node modules. So, as we see, when we install a node module, what we're installing is going to go live in this folder. So then we can use it within the modules and libraries we create. That's common in really any JavaScript project. Source, as a developer, this is where you're going to be doing your work. This is where you're going to be training your modules and such that you can then interact with on your instance. Target, this is metadata again for the SDK in terms of when you're building and deploying where it's going. I'm not really even sure what the lint configs, like if you want to change your linting within your thing, you can change some stuff here. And then package and package lock, again, this is where you're going to set up your scope and dependencies and such. And when you see the actual file, it'll make more sense. But that's where, if you install an npm package, that package itself is version. So you're saying what is your code dependent on, what version of that, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll see this here in a second. And then we're going to go ahead and play around with actually building something. So if I go into VS Code, and look at my folders here, right? Metadata, like this is your app XML file. I think we're used to here on this app. You can kind of see everything here, nice and easy. .now has a lot of stuff in here I'm not even going to look at. Same with dist, you know, node modules. So all of your node modules you might want to use. Source. So this is where we're going to be spending most of our time with the work. This is ServiceNow's kind of templatized version to show you what you can do. So, you know, we're working outside of ServiceNow, so we don't really have access to like the normal ServiceNow commands and such we're used to, right? Like Glide Record or Glide System. But ServiceNow has implemented them as their own packages. So, you know, this is what we're going to do for other packages we want to use, but ServiceNow has their own that we can use. So if we want to use Glide, for example, we can import GS from ServiceNow Glide and then, you know, run anything like a add info message, anything like that. You can do Glide Record too. We can import Glide Record and start working with Glide Record too, et cetera, et cetera. So this is where you're going to be spending most of your time importing packages or modules from Node, and then creating your own modules and stuff that you can then use within ServiceNow. So in this case, I can export out this function, which is going to do some stuff, and then I can leverage this within, let's say, a business rule. So for example, and this is, again, from an XML view, we can see this in the instance, but ServiceNow is saying, you know, in this business rule, I'm going to be importing in this function that I created through the SDK, and then I'm going to run that function and do something.
So where does it put it, I guess?
Yes, perfect. As part of Washington, there's a new global table called ECM script modules. And when you push to your instance, you're going to be pushing here in essence. So if we look at the application we just created, two things were added. First, the package JSON, which has, you know, this is what a package JSON kind of looks like, right? It tells you your name, tells you your scope, right? So this is where it knows what scope you're in, your scope ID. So you can't be just like pushing changes to the wrong scope. If the instance doesn't have this scope, you're going to get an error, right? And then your dependencies. So this is your kind of basic dependencies that come out of the box, your Glide, your ESLint, and such. So you get these modules, and these modules are not editable. Like I can't edit anything in here. It's constrained to the main role because ServiceNow is saying you have to use SDK to touch this. And then, right, the function itself lives here. And then this is what you're actually calling within your business rule.
That's pretty nifty. But as a side note, this is going to be one more place to look when we're scripting now, and you see that require, and it's like, oh, you'll need to know to go here. So this is good
Exactly.
for everyone to know.
Yeah, and this is where, as we go through this, I'm trying to show kind of we're so used to ServiceNow, right? This is all fun and nifty, but like at the end of the day, when you're doing anything in ServiceNow, it's not looking here, right? It's looking at it at your instance and doing stuff from your instance. So where
Right.
does all this stuff live, right? And yeah, to your point, it's another place to look. If you ever see that require command, you're going to want to know to come here. And you know, it can get into a little bit of file inception for sure, right? Like a script include, like go from here to here to here to here to see what's happening, for
So
instance.
as a side note, I'm noticing that the import is left in this module, which means I guess the inference is you're using this module's GS, and which is maybe not necessarily the GS, the other GS in ServiceNow, which means there may not be feature parity between the two.
Yeah, and it's a great call because right, another thing from this is, and I would like to say ServiceNow would keep those in parity, but who knows, right? But because this is through Node, they are not constrained at all to ServiceNow upgrades, right? They can push changes to these things whenever the heck they want. I don't know if they have that documented anywhere. I know I'm in version 1.0.3 of this SDK, but even your like GS, right, library, that could be versioned and they could start adding more to it. This is our function here. I'm going to show you kind of the easy, like I'm going to install a node module here, Lodash quickly and just do a quick couple small things, and we'll see kind of how the full build and deploy process works. So, I'm working here. I have my function here. Honestly, I might just create my own function. We can kind of do that. So we're going to call this, I don't know, custom, or we'll just call this share the wealth as a JavaScript. And I'll throw it in my source file. It's a copy of this, but the first thing I want to do is install Lodash to this project. Don't have it currently. So right now, this is where you're going to be within your terminal. So right now, I'm at the SDK sandbox kind of root folder. But if I want to go deeper into my project folder, which is where I'm going to be for this, I can do a command called cd and do cd stw051724. And now I'm within that folder. Alternatively, I can just right click and then in Visual Studio Code and open it directly in my terminal from there. So that's great. In terms of the actual install, so we have Node installed. So npm, which is Node Package Manager, it's a very easy interface to use to install things. So if I want to install Lodash, for example, I can run just simply npm install Lodash. Hit enter, and a lot of things are happening. If you're like me and kind of curious what some of this means, like 34 packages are looking for funding, that just means like there's nothing wrong. It's just like the teams who have built those packages are like, give me money, right? I was really curious what this meant, so it's fun. Now what happens when we installed Lodash? First, if we go to our node modules here and we look at Lodash, it'll be here now. We have access to a lot of stuff that comes with Lodash, so that's pretty nifty. And then how do we use it? So we can import specific things from Lodash into our code. There's different ways you can import everything, but I think common or best practice is let me just import what I need, right? So I've done this before, so let me just look it up to make sure I do it again. Yeah, it's just that. So I know there's an uppercase, and again, there's a lot of good Visual Studio Code gives you a lot of nice things, like it'll tell you what exists. So I can import uppercase from Lodash. So I'm just saying I just want to import this from this entire package because I don't want access to the entire thing in this script. What I can do here then is maybe I'm going to just comment out this code and I'm going to write my own code and just say add info message. This should be an uppercase. And then I can just run my uppercase from Lodash against, let's say, the new status, which we're passing into this function automatically. Right? Very simple use case just on what you can do. I'm going to save that and I'm going to call this good. So, at this point, let's just say I'm happy with everything. I want to start pushing this to my instance. What do I do? So if I go back to my commands, just to make sure I know what I'm doing, I want to do a fetch first to make sure that my metadata, in case anyone's like updated anything since I've done this, just to be safe, I'm going to run an now SDK fetch, and we're good. Fetched whatever it needed to. And then we're going to do a build command and then a deploy command. So there's one extra step here than I think a lot of us are used to. We need to run a build command, which is kind of like a compile command if you've ever done development, where you're saying like, let me take what I've done and let the system translate this into a way ServiceNow can understand. So if I run an SDK build, it's just going to do some stuff in the background. Those folders that I say that ServiceNow is doing stuff with, you can look in them and they're doing stuff, right? They're taking what you've done and they're converting them into like an XML or something that then ServiceNow can ingest. And once you do a build, you can do a deploy. So I'll run a now SDK deploy. And it deployed to the instance. So that's great. So if we go back to our instance, and if I refresh this, well, nothing's going to be there. If I refresh this in our modules, we should hopefully see some new things came through. And we did. So in the last couple minutes here, 3 new modules came through. First, Lodash itself came through, right? If we're going to use it, we need to bring it in. So yes, it's quite heavy. but it does exist now in there. The updated package JSON, or the package JSON for Lodash itself, because right, Lodash itself might have dependency, so it's a hierarchical kind of thing. And then our function itself here, and we can see our new module has the show status update, and you can see the comment I made and the new info message I made. And if I come into my business rule here, don't ask me why their formatting is meh. I mean, I know you don't need it, but I'd very much recommend like write business rules in the way we're used to. We'll see when this business rule shows up what they actually did. So they just have an after update right now on this table, and this is what they have in their kind of demo stuff where it's very similar to what we just did, right? We're taking that show status update method from the file in the ECM script module, and now we're running it, on an update. So in practice, what does this actually look like? So, we should see some info messages change when we do this. So if I show this in a list, create a record here, do something, a new status. Guess there's a limit on it. We can save this and then run something status update, I think. New status upped. So we can see that those functions ran. The uppercase did not run, so we can go and look at that quickly. But in essence, the function we wrote is now here and it's doing stuff. So that's pretty cool. So this was the original one, right? I need to actually update this because if we look at our script modules, this is called STW now, right? I created a new one. So I need to return that. So I'm taking this function from there. So, right, it's pretty much telling you where it exists in your file nav here. Dot just says go to the root, go to source, go to STW.js. So in essence, right, we're coming into here, and then we're going to just take this function from it, which is this function here that we're exporting out. And then now we're going to use this function here to do something. So, now that I do that, when we run this, the code that we actually wrote will run relative to the out-of-the-box code. New state. So make sure this saves first. That's saved. If I run this now, new state, right? So now we can see in uppercase because of Lodash, this is updated. Cool. So that's at a very high level, getting this installed, starting to be able to use it, and now you have access to a lot of fun stuff you can do. Normally, right, when new things are introduced to the instance, it's through like update sets or stuff. When they're doing that, when you're pushing from your SDK to the instance, it actually is creating an upgrade record, which is kind of fun. So we can see when I ran this, like I can have a traceability in terms of any time anyone pushed to this instance using the SDK, it'll live in these upgrades. I mean, if you open it up, it's pretty minor, but it'll show you some things that happen. So we can see that this file stw.js came in, the Lodash dependency came in, and a package JSON came in, all within that ECM modules. So there is some traceability, obviously, in terms of like how things got into the instance, but they chose to put into the upgrades. So a couple examples then what you can do with this in a little more detail. So I have this sandbox project, very similar, but I've done a little bit of more work in terms of like bringing in some stuff. So I brought in some functions from like validator, or there's format or day.js, all these node modules, right? If you hate glide daytime, for example, like you can run this to do some formatting and play with day.js, which has, I think, maybe a little bit of easier stuff to work with. Validator, I think, is pretty cool. There's some things you can just run in is email, is hex color, is IP. There's like hundreds of these to say like, if I need to do some data validation, these functions should automatically exist already. So pretty fun to play with. One thing is, right, if I'm writing code in here and I want to test it quickly, how can I do that? So this is just like any JavaScript file. You can just run a console.log and start playing with things. So if I have a console.log and I just want to do an is email command, I can run the command as node, and then I just have to put in the file name. So what I need to do first actually is get out of this terminal and open up this in its terminal. So we're at this file path. Yep. And then I can just run node validator.js, and it'll run that console.log on this. And, I can start doing some unit tests myself, just to make sure what I'm doing is working. Test at gmail.com. Is that valid? Save this. There's a lot of nifty commands. If I just run the up arrow, I can run this again. True. So I can see that this function is kind of working as I expect. That's pretty sweet. Then I can use it however I want. Like now, once I export this to my instance, I can start using these in my instance. And then, there's different tests like validator test. So this is getting into some of that unit testing you can set up. So using assert and test from the node modules, and bringing in then those functions. So let me take this from the top. So I'm importing in two packages from node, assert and test. Also, then I'm importing in those functions that I want to test. So they live in my, in this file path and in this script. And then I created 3 tests here. So if you've done ATS, it's kind of the similar concept here. Created a few parent tests, and then these awaits are, you kind of consider them subtests. So each of these subtests is going to do a validation. If both of these pass, the top one will pass, right? So I'm pretty much doing like an email validation. I'm giving it real emails or invalid emails, etc. Just like some quick tests here. You can make these more robust if you want. But then if I want to run this, I'm lazy, so I'm just going to open the terminal from here. I can run node validator test.js. And this is my 9 tests have run, all 9 have passed. So this is great. This worked perfectly. And yeah, so then the final thing I wanted to show here is how you can actually use like glide record per se within these. So, we're all very familiar and use glide record all the time. We can import in glide record itself from that ServiceNow glide package. So we're just saying we only want glide record. We don't need glide system. I could always just do this and say, let's bring in glide record and glide system. The points earlier, right? This isn't exactly maybe fully up to date. I think it is, but we're going to have to track that because this is coming from this package, maybe not from the instance itself. But yeah, you can run your functions here. So, right, like I can create a function and just use glide record like I normally would get the count of incidents in my application. I can also do some fun stuff like I can pass in a user and get all of the incidents from that. I was just playing around with the compact function from Lodash where, it'll pretty much, if you have an array of things, it's going to remove all of your falsy values. So in this case, I just added in a false and an empty and run a compact against it, and I'll get all the numbers cleaned out here. But this is kind of how you can integrate glide record into these modules too that you're creating. So I'll show you that one in practice that one's a little more built out. So if I switch to that application, that's my SDK sandbox. I can just I already have my business rules and such set up in the back end, right? If I just run this, right? Like now it's getting those incident numbers using that function I just showed you, where I'm running a glide record call through my SDK. And I validated my email too. Now I don't know in practice how people are going to do this. One thing I thought of is, right, I created this validator script include where I just literally bring in that like the validator script that I did from my SDK, and then just made it very easy. So more in a ServiceNow way, you might think like I can just call this script include and run this function, and it's going to do an email check, but it's actually calling the module that I brought in, and just checking the email. So this is where I say you can get into some file inception if you build things in certain ways, but this could be a cool way to bring in like an imported node package and set it up in a way that then your other developers can leverage without really having to think about what the require or anything does, right? So you got a lot of options here. And yeah, that's really what I wanted to show there. I'll go back to the presentation here. We kind of covered this already, but import export, you're really developing modules, right? So then you're exposing those modules in your application and then leverage across your development objects. What's happening when you deploy to an instance, right? When you build a command, package is created. We saw that. When you deploy to the instance, all of your work is saved to the scope. Doesn't show any information as now. Like we saw that plugin installation. It shows you a little bit, but not too much information. Everything lives within that sysmodule table. It's read-only outside the SDK. And then that can be imported into any ServiceNow script using the same syntax. And then obviously like this work can then all be pushed into update sets or your app repo to handle through your normal process to move that up environments, right? Your SDK never needs to be linked to prod. Your SDK would be linked to a dev environment. You'll get the code into your dev environment, and then you can start pushing that up environments like you normally would. And finally, best practice, run the SDK fetch before you push anything to the environment so you keep it updated. But you can look through your command options and see what you can do to, maybe just push an incremental update or do a full reinstall, etc. So how can this support you in practice, right? This is one of those new fancy things from ServiceNow. It's great to show the direction they're going in terms of enabling development in the SDK. Right now, I mean, what I could see it being useful is if you have complex scripting requirements and NPM functions will help you, you can usually set this up relatively quickly, get those functions available within your instance, and then keep using those as you normally would. The main limitation from this is it's another place to go and do work, right? Like you're used to being in ServiceNow to do your work. You might be integrated with VS Code to keep your scripts, save your scripts offline or actually sync them together. But you're definitely going to have to be in VS Code to use it or any IDE to use this. The product team from ServiceNow has mentioned that one of their goals, and we'll see it in Xanadu, I think, is to really enable you to do more work from VS Code if you want to be there. So you don't have to be jumping back and forth. Now to Blake's point earlier, and Brandon's point, we'll have to see how that works with multiple people working within the same application, right? But it's nice to know that that's a direction they're going. And it just obviously will require team communication if someone's working in it, right? Hey, I exposed these modules, you can now use them in your scripts, et cetera, et cetera. Some miscellaneous notes. It's compatible with scoped and global apps right now, so not like a store app or not with like global out of the box. It's outside of how ServiceNow ships their upgrades, right? As we talked about earlier, they can make an upgrade to this at any point. Doesn't require Xanadu, doesn't require any ServiceNow app upgrades or such. You can change your XML data. So like, when I'm within here, I can look and see like all of these different files I have. Like I can see my business rules here. I can theoretically make changes here and push them up into the instance. I could like change the name of this. ServiceNow tells you don't, because that's not going to get stored in your sys update XML. So it can get really weird and really finicky quickly if you do that. So don't recommend touching those XML files from this. As we saw in the business rule, some syntax is missing. I have no idea why. I just clean it up. Your script modules do not show up in Studio. So if you're used to developing scoped apps in Studio or App Engine Studio or whatever it is, make sure you know and save that as a favorite, because that's going to be important if you're doing any work like this. You can test code in your command line as I showed you. You just have to set up your project to be a module. So in your package JSON, I can show that really quickly here. So in my Now SDK sandbox project, in my package JSON here, I added this just to saying my entire project's like I'm setting up modules, just enables me to do that unit testing. One challenge with this, right, if you're doing glide record calls, like I can't just unit test in my VS Code because I'm not synced to the ServiceNow's database, so nothing's going to work there. So you're going to have to test any of your glide record calls or any of that stuff or any interactions to the ServiceNow database in the instance right now. and a ton of documents, right? SDK, how you install it, if you need to switch node versions, if you have multiple installed, an introduction to NPM. I use VS Code. You can use any IDE you want. ServiceNow had a great like hour-long video about this with the product managers from this. Kind of talk through this in a little more detail. I took a lot of this from there, but if you want to see it from the source, you can go there. And then some documentation on the CLI commands. With that, that's all I really wanted to cover. A brief but maybe overwhelming intro into what's potentially possible with the SDK long term.